Okay, so the scene created previously, I've named clone placement underscore 002 underscore attract underscore repel. Because it's got the attract and repel set up for the volume and the two different cloners. Let's take a look at, let's say we wanted to add in some water to the scene. Let's kind of clip out within the terrain. So I'm going to go ahead and just use a plane for this. And we can bring it up. Also, to speed things up, we can just turn off the clones for now. And I'm going to extend these, or this area, to the outside. So now we have some water added. And right now the clones are going to appear within the water. So if we want to remove that set of objects or all of those clones from the water, one of the easiest ways is to use the plane effector. Now the reason we can't use the water object itself, or what's going to end up being water, is because only the intersections will be calculated for the removal. This is when we're using the fall off of the effectors. So what we can do is add in the plane effector. And now we're going to need to select both of the cloners, go to the effector list, and add in that plane, or the plane effector. And now we can select that, and we need to turn back on our clones. And at the moment, what's happening is the plane effector is set to a position change. So it's kind of kicking everything up in the scene. Also looks like there's a difference in the scaling than there was before. So let's figure out why that is. We'll turn off the small trees first. Turn on large trees. I'm going to turn off the plane effector for the moment. And it might just need to refresh. Either that or it was not refreshed earlier. So the shader effector looks like it may not be in either of the lists, because when I did select both of them and drag that in, it updated them to be exactly the same. So we need to go to the large trees, remove the volume effector, and add back in the shader effector. So it looks like that's probably not a good way to place in your effectors in the list by selecting multiple objects, because those additional values will be copied over to both of the objects. So going back to the plane effector, making sure it's in both lists, we're going to set up and turn on the visibility. And now we need to set off the fall off, which we're going to change to linear. And we also need to rotate the effector to properly remove things. We're going to set the fall off function to linear, increase the fall off, which we can see exactly where it is cutting everything. So we need basically to rotate this in the correct direction. Also, because of the minimum and maximum values, it may need to be changed a little further. So we're going to rotate this -90. And I'm going to turn off the clones for the moment, just to set this up. We're going to scale it, adjust the size, and go to the side view, and just make sure that we're going to line this up with where the water is showing. We might need to end up facing the other direction with this. We'll have to take a look and see. So we can turn back on both of the clones, go to the plane effector, and we might need to just modify the minimum maximum values. We'll go ahead and take a look. And we may just need to move it. It might be facing the wrong direction. There's also a possibility of improper refresh, so if you need to, you can just change sometimes the seed value, and that'll refresh it. But it looks like that's not the problem. So go ahead and just change these values to get it. Let's clip that out. So I'm going to go ahead, turn off the clones, and rotate around the plane effector the other direction. And we may just need to go ahead and set our position. And we just work with one of the objects to make it a little easier once we have the influence set up correctly. And we can see what is happening is it basically kind of a reverse what we're looking for. And because the way the clones are being created, we may have to set up a duplicate to get it to remove them correctly. So if needed, what we can do to modify this a little better is to we can change this to a different type of mode. Let's go ahead and set it to a box, so that way we have more of a finite value within the box. And then our fall off, we're going to set all the way to 0. And because it is inverting, we're going to go over to the effector and change the minimum maximum values, setting them both to 0. We can turn off invert. And now the position isn't perfect, as you can see. So if we increase the fall off, we might be able to match it a little bit better, because it looks like just the overall preview of this subtraction doesn't necessarily reflect the way the fall off is showing. And linear is definitely working better. So with the linear mode, it looks like it's going to be the best way to do it, and we could just move this up and down to subtract from the bottom. We turn on our small trees, which are also going to get all of their positions removed. And then if we go to the minimum maximum value, you can see that we can extend further. But it looks like mostly it's going to subtract even more and probably use a bit more of the fall off. So maximum 0, minimum 0 seems to be the best way to do that, at least for this setup. So now we have our water and no clones underneath it. So we can clip that away even further just by modifying this plane effector. And setting that value. If you want, you can add the control to basically link together the plane and the effector together. So if we want to raise the water, we can select the plane effector With now the water added, go ahead and rename that plane water as a sub-object or child of the plane effector. And that way they move together. You can also set it up with Espresso to link that, but the thing is, because we don't have an exact placement of the plane effector, that may not be suitable. Another thing to keep in mind is if we take a look, it might be the overall height and I'm just adjusting this because what we can end up doing is adding clones to underneath the volume effector. So where it is not positioned, it's just going to cut out kind of the center and then still place objects above and below. So we'll just adjust that to match the water as best as possible by raising the height. And now we have kind of a dynamic influence there. So if we need to raise the water up, grab the plane effector and raise them both a little higher. So now if we want to do kind of the opposite and have objects being populated around the edge, then we can use another type of effector for that. And in this case, I would want a different object to be used, maybe some reeds or something like that. We would need to set up another cloner object was really going to be the best way to achieve this, along with an effector that is going to affect just the placement of the new object. So we can set up a new preview object if we want. We can go over to the scene where I created that other tree and add in, we just use the cylinder again, 3 for the rotation segments, and in the model mode just scaling it down. And then I don't want it to be too large or too small. So we're just going to have thin, more reed-like objects. And what I'm going to do is copy and paste this. Just add a little tiny bit of rotation, just to create a couple of objects that will show all together. So we can see a little bending in different viewports, or from different angles and views. We can also change scale. And that should work out pretty well. So remembering before about the caps, it is automatically going to add in those caps because of the type of object it is, and you can't really remove the segment amount. So what I'm going to do is just grab all the objects, hit C on the keyboard to make them editable, go over to the polygon mode. We can select the tops, turn off the only select visible elements, select the top, and we're going to just melt all of these. And then I'm going to delete the bottom ones. So all the polygons on the bottom. Now we can make sure that nothing is selected and go to select the optimize to remove any additional points. If you want, you can also just turn off the angle limits on these objects. If you want to, maybe to add a bit more the realism, you can grab the top polygons and then just using scale, size them down. Add in the connect object. Add those to the connect object. I'm going to turn off weld and then hit C on the keyboard to make those editable. So we can call this either small plants or reeds or really whatever. I'm just going to call these plants. And then we can add a new material. But I'm going to go ahead and do that in the other scene to prevent me from having to create another layer within this scene. So we'll select the model, copy it, and actually I am going to modify the object axis first. And now select the model, copy it, go over to the other scene, and paste that in. The plants, under previs, we're going to create a new layer, call it plants. You have to assign that to the layer. And then for the color, let's go ahead and make these kind of browner, yellower looking. Add a little bit of the luminance, yellow, turn that down, and assign that to the plant object. Now, if you're using the materials on the cloner, now I have mine set up just to affect the individual objects, but if you do have them on the cloner object, you will need to set up a selection tag. So we're going to select, and let's use the small trees, copy and paste the cloner, delete all of the trees inside of it, add the plants, rename the cloner plants, or water plants, really whatever you want. Go to the effectors list, and we are going to remove all of the effector influences. So right now we have these showing up everywhere throughout the scene, but we just want them showing around the water's edge and maybe going in. So what we can do is add another volume effector, or we can copy and paste the current one. It's also a good idea to start setting up individual names, because if you have effectors with the same name, even if they're not dragged in the list, they may affect the other objects. So if I add another volume effector and it has the same name as this one, it might be applied to the rest of the clones. So we're going to say small tree effect for the other effector. And then the shader, I don't have any duplicates right now, so I'm going to keep that the same. We'll go ahead and add in the volume effector and turning off scale, and just once again using the same setup where we have it on. We can either copy over the same settings. I think what I end up doing, since the other one's already set up, is copy and paste the small tree effector and call this plants. And then what we can do is replace the source link under fall off with that water plane, which does need to be polygons. So let's go ahead and take a look, turning off the clones and the new clones as well. Switching over to the wireframe mode, because loading the wireframe of all the additional clones can take a lot longer. Now we may need to increase the polygon amount. Another thing you could do is set up an object just for influence that's not going to render. So what I can do is copy and paste the water, call this water plant effect. Actually, it would be an A, because it is going to affect the plants. Actually, either way, it really it kind of works both ways in this case, because it is an effect, kind of a special effect. It does directly affect things as well in both directions. So if we need to set up more width, height segments, we can increase it to 50, just to make sure we have enough polygons to connect with the terrain. So once that's set up, we'll hit C on the keyboard to make it editable. Turn on the X-ray mode for this. Add it to the water object. Make sure it's not going to show up in the render. We can still keep it open in the preview. And then when we go to that new plant effector, we can add in that object. So now we're going to go ahead and turn on just the plant cloner. And we're going to need to set this up to influence this a little bit more. Go to the plants, select effector, drag in that volume effector. and now modify the volume. We can change the fall off. I am going to change this over to the linear mode. And I'm going to change the sample distance to 3. And now we can see them just basically showing around the edges of the water. And it looks like the other clone points that we're seeing are left over from the other clones showing in the scene, just showing the display of the weight. Since we're pretty much done with those weights at the moment, we're going to go over to those cloner objects under Transform and select None for the preview. And that way we don't have anything interfering with the current setup. Because sometimes the sizes of your objects will change, and it might be hard to tell whether or not that is an actual clone or just a really small, or one of the other clones, or a really small object. So now we can go into the Effector and fine-tune it and increase the distance from the object. And you can see it's also going to extend down below into the water, which is what I want for this setup. If you do want them only around the edge intersection, and you do not want them to show under the water, then we would need to modify either the minimum and maximum values. We'll see if that ends up being efficient enough or works. Might just need to set some of these values and invert it. It looks like that's probably not going to work for this. So what we could do is add the plane effector to the effectors list, the one that was removing the other objects in the scene. Even that looks like it is not removing them. We may just need to go to the object, change the seed, so that way, in this case, what we would have to do, more than likely, is modify the effect, changing basically the height. Because of the way the fall-off is set up, these are very small objects, so it is going to affect them differently. So we may need to just create an additional plane effector. So I'm going to remove the plane effector from that list. I'm also going to go ahead and take these plants and move them down with the other clones. But I do want to have these underneath. So I'm going to go ahead and keep the current setup. Keep in mind we can still modify that fall off or choose a different type of fall off. And if we step it, we do have to invert. So I'm going to use the linear, invert that, kind of adjust the fall off the way I want it. And then we can modify scale, or the amount of objects that are going to show, by selecting the cloner itself and modifying the count. We could bring that up to maybe 8,000 to show even more, turning off the wireframe mode. Maybe going ahead, bringing that down to 4. Another thing we could do is if we want to have different types of objects in the setup, if we go to the cloner object, select the plant, copy and paste it, and now set up another material. Select the plants, copy, paste, and call this plants 1, and just change it so it looks different. and we can tell that it's a different plant. And apply that to the object using the new material. So this one's much more yellow. If we choose to use this effector to modify the clone, we can use the influence that is not only adding the position, but also modifying where they're showing or being placed. Which means we can also go over to the cloner object itself, change the clone type to sort, and then under the plane effector, under the plant volume effector, if we need to limit the clone amount, it looks like in this case that's not going to work because we've had the minimum and maximum values set to 0. Therefore the output is identical, and it is going to need a minimum and maximum value to change that setting. So what we can do is turn off the modify clone, increase the weight transformation, and then use another effector object to affect the position. So we might need to go ahead and grab that plant volume, copy and paste it. Plants, call it sort. Turn off the visibility. Turn off the weight transformation. Add the new plant sort to the list. And we're going to need to modify the minimum and maximum values. It looks like I might have had the wrong object selected before. That was 0, 0. That was the plane effector, not the plant effector. We're going to go ahead, invert the fall off, turn the weight down to 0, use the modify clone, and we might need to increase sample distance. And in this case, we might even need to change the placement of our effectors in the list to sort them before we remove them, which is sometimes needed. And going back to the menu, and changing this to the original setup, setting up a refresh for the seed. And it is a little difficult to tell the different colorations, so I am going to go back to the material, change plants 1 to being very orange, and the other plants to being a lot darker. And that way, when they do start to show, it'll be a little easier to see. Once we start bringing in the other weight, you can see the clones do start to transform, but now we're losing our subtraction on the top. And a lot of that has to do with the order and the sort order. So let's go ahead and turn off that display. And it's still changing this, so we're going to move the plant sort to the bottom of the list. And then also go to the plant cloner and turn off that weight influence. So now we're going to go back to that effector and start to use the modify clone, which is going to subtract from the top. We still have a mix because the way the sort order is set up within the cloner. So let's go ahead and change that over to sort. So we will need to approach this a little differently. I'm going to grab that sort object, the duplicate, change this over to linear, and I'm going to go back to the effector and change the minimum value all the way up to 100%. So now we can see on one side of this plane we have, or populating or showing up cloning on the terrain, one object, on the other side the other. So we need to rotate this to be on the other axis. So I'm going to rotate it down, and then we can just position it so that we have the objects below being the darker of the plants, and then the lighter ones showing on top. So that way we have our separation that way. And then we can modify fall-off amounts by adjusting this linear fall-off. And then if I need to increase or decrease, we can go to the other fall-off option and have a different setup for that. So you can add as many objects as you want to the plant list. Right now we just have 2, and they will descend down into the water in order. So if we need to have more variation, we might need to set up an additional effector. So I'm going to go ahead and set up a random effector to modify the plants. Go to the random and make sure we turn off position. And now if we start to use the modify clone, it's just going to randomly kind of interrupt what's currently there. Now depending on the weight setup for the other object, if we go to the weight, increasing the weight of the plant sort, and then going to the fall off option for the new random effector and turning off the weight option, it should affect the influence depending on the weight setup. Because it's such a very small area, the weight, which you can see in the preview, is almost the same. So in this case, modifying the weight from the random is going to give us more of a change. So if we were to make any further changes beyond that, like say scaling. And then visibility will cut out some of the opposite values. So we would need to set minimum to 0 in order to get the actual change to show cut out. So we can go back now. And you can, if you want to turn off these effectors from the view, turn off the visible option, and that way they won't show the actual effector if it's, say, getting in the way, interrupting the scene at all in your preview. So now we can go back, turn on the different trees, and we can see the scene variation. And because we don't need to see the weights anymore of the other objects, we can turn off the X-ray mode and then start to see things a little better. And also start thinking about swapping out these objects for the real rendered objects and what we're actually going to be using for the final product rather than just a placement. But also keeping in mind that we can cache the placement of these previs objects and just swap them out with the higher res ones, and they will keep in the exact same position and also inherit the scaling. Right now we really don't have any scaling changes, just kind of the same setup for everything.